Education. My name is Rene Trentin. I am the director of the school, and today we're going to celebrate and receive for this event the centennial of Paulo Freire and Raymond Williams. We're going to start our international colloquium, Sparks of Transformation, Paulo Freire and Raymond Williams.
Okay.
The broadcast is okay. I'm having a small echo here. I'm not sure if it's only happening with me. I'm sorry. Let's continue. Initially, I would like to say a few thank yous. First of all, to the EAD, the online education team represented by Yolanda Barbosa, and also the events team represented by Juliana Lourenço. Thank you all very much for the effort and for making this event available to us. I would also like to thank the Instituto Dialética, represented by Anthony Tayeb, the interpreters who are with us today, Adriana Vieira and Natalia Lessa. Also, Vitor Rocha, our technical support that is guaranteeing our quality of our work this day. I would also like to welcome our distinguished guests in the morning to celebrate the centennial of Paulo Freire and Raymond Williams, Professor Luiza Cortesão from the University of Porto and the Paulo Freire Institute of Portugal. Thank you very much, Professor Luiza. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. Professor Débora Mazza from the Faculty of Education of Unicamp, our colleague. Thank you, Professor Débora. It's also a pleasure to have you here. Both of them are also going to start the homages to Paulo Freire that are going to begin in this morning. We're going to have Professor Nima Spigolon that is going to mediate this first session. I would also like to thank the professors that are going to take part in the international conference in the afternoon, Professor Maria Elisa Sevasco from the University of São Paulo, and Professor Dr. Daniel Williams from the Swansea University from Wales, who is also here with us. Welcome, Professor. It's an honor to have you here. We're also going to have an homage paid by Professor Dr. Hywell Dix from Bournemouth University of London that is going to do the closing conference comparing Paulo Freire and Raymond Williams. I would like to thank Professor João Paulo Roni, professor and president of ABRESC from the Brazilian Academy of Writers of São José do Rio Preto, who invited us to publish an ebook about the event. We're very happy with this invitation, and we hope to be able to accept it and move forward with the publication of this ebook. I would also like to thank Luiza for the production and edition, and also the collaboration in the soundtrack of the video that is going to be broadcast later on in honor of Paulo Freire, Caio Vilela for the soundtrack, and Professor Eliana Mubi that narrated the text of this video. Lastly, I would like to thank especially Professor Alexandre Paixão, my friend and my brother here, who took part in the direction and planning of this event. Thank you, Ale. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Thank you to the audience that is watching us on YouTube, and I would like to wish you a great event. To open this colloquium, I prepared a text, but before I move on with reading this text, I had to make a small preamble because we are being watched also from people from other countries, and Brazil is undergoing a very dramatic situation today. We are a few days from celebrating the independence of the country on the next September 7th. In normal times, this independence was already questioned because of the way that it happened historically. And today, in the context where we live, this questioning is even more necessary and urgent. We know very well that there is no freedom without social justice, dignified work and salary, decent housing, security, food on the table, quality education, health, respect to life, and human rights. And today, all of this that actually have never fully achieved is even more threatened by an extreme right, fascist, genocide, corrupted, lying government that despites science and hates the truth. That's why for us Brazilians to proclaim our independence today means to yell out Bolsonaro and out with the fascism. Having said this small preamble, I would like to pass the floor now to the text that I prepared as the opening of this colloquium in honor of the centennial of Paulo Freire, which is an homage of the Faculty of Education. 100 years, more precisely, September 19, 1921, in Recife, Paulo Freire was born. He was the son of a military mother and a military father and a Catholic mother. He said he learned from him love and tolerance, qualities that he also knew how to demonstrate and teach. He also said that he knew how to read in the shadow of a mango tree, in the backyard of his house, in the hands of his mother, who wrote on the floor using a stick sentences of her life. They planted there, maybe, the seeds of his future method of literacy that had as a principle, starting from the cultural universe of the students. In his high school, Paulo Freire became a teacher of Portuguese, and then he had a degree in law by the University of Recife, but he soon realized that he wasn't born to be a lawyer, except maybe metaphorically. If we take into account that he became a strong defender of the popular layers and their right to free education, quality education, and liberating education. Professionally, however, he decided to dedicate to teaching, working initially as a Portuguese teacher. In 1946, Paulo Freire took the role of director of the Department of Education and Culture of the Social Service of the Industries, SESI, in the state of Pernambuco, where he started his work of teaching adults how to read and write. Later, in 1961, he became the director of the Department of Cultural Extensions at the University of Recife, which allowed him to develop with his work team his revolutionary method of literacy, which later was globally known as the Paulo Freire method. This method aimed not only at training the students to decode the written word, but also, and above all, to help them learn how to read the world and interpret it critically. Its ultimate goal was raising the awareness of the oppressed about the factors that determined their oppression in order to speak for themselves, their own words, and to act as their own autonomous subjects of their own liberation. That's why the method was revolutionary. The success of this experience drew the attention of the government of President João Goulart that incorporated the method Paulo Freire in the National Literacy Plan that predicted the deployment of several groups of literacy all over the country. Naturally, the disclosure of a pedagogy like this, such radically committed with the poor and with the transformation of the oppressive reality, disturbed the conservative sectors of the Brazilian society. With the coup d'etat from 1964 and the installation of the civil military dictatorship in the country, this experience was brutally interrupted. Paulo Freire was arrested, accused of subversion, and posteriorly exiled. He started living in Bolivia and then Chile, in the United States, and then in Switzerland. He worked as an invited professor in some of the most renowned universities in the world, like Harvard in Columbia in the United States and the University of Geneva in Switzerland. In 1980, with the amnesty, Paulo Freire returned to Brazil, and the Faculty of Education of Unicamp had a decisive role in this return. That year, the director of the institution, Professor Antônio Muniz de Rezende, in a gesture of deep commitment with the democracy and with the education, and also a huge personal courage, submitted to Paulo Freire a formal invitations for him to work at Unicamp in our faculty. That was a gesture of courage because we were still very afraid and very insecure because despite the amnesty, dictatorship was not over yet. At the university, faculty and students were directly threatened and had the risk of dismissal in the case of the faculty and even imprisonment. The governor of São Paulo, Paulo Maluf, ally of the dictatorship, actually stated an intervention at the Unicamp, preventing the election of the new dean and canceling the nomination of several directors of institutes. Thanks to this invitation of the director of the Faculty of Education and also the actions of other teachers and faculty of this school, Paulo Freire, after a while, could be hired by Unicamp and could become a teacher and a professor of the Faculty of Education. And he remained here from 1981 to 1999. The life and work of Paulo Freire are a legacy of academic value, of academic, political, cultural value, and it's priceless, not only to Brazil, but for the world. Today, he's still one of the most read, cited, and translated authors in the country and in the planet. As a recognition of this value, he received several awards, including over 40 titles of the Dr. Honoris Causa, granted by several universities in the country and abroad. At Unicamp, it wasn't different. Here in our university, this honor was granted by the University Council in 1988, 1 year before the first direct election for President of the Republic, which would mark a definition of the redemocratization of the country. The return of Paulo Freire, as well as the return of the direct elections, are symbolic expressions of overcoming the difficult years and the victory of democracy. Such victory that today needs to be reaffirmed, defended, and protected with all of our strength. In 2012, 15 years after his death, Paulo Freire received the title of Patron of the Brazilian Education, granted by law 12,612, proposed by the federal representative Luiza and sanctioned by President Dilma Rousseff. With this law and this title, the Brazilian state, now under the wings of democracy and freedom, repaired as much as possible the arbitrary violence that were practiced against Paulo Freire. That was the official recognition of his immeasurable contribution for the overcoming of illiteracy and other harms in the field of education that affect, above all, the poorest ones, the ones that are dismissed from life, the condemned in the earth, the pariahs of the world, the oppressed. In summary, that was the definitive recognition of his commitment towards a liberating education. In 2018, with the ascension of a government of extreme right with fascist traits, we had an intensification of attacks that were already occurring against education and the figure of Paulo Freire, which culminated with the attempt also through a bill of law of revoking his title of patron of the Brazilian education. But the progressive sectors of society reacted, and they ban this movement. In the Faculty of Education, for example, in November in 2018, during the first seminar of researches of the students of master's program coordinated by Professor Nima Spigolon, that is going to be here with us this morning. She's going to mediate the table. Students and professors of the public network that took part in this event started a petition proposing that the main building of the Faculty of Education started being called Building Professor Paulo Freire. This petition afterwards had the signature of students from the undergraduate programs, faculty, technical and administrative professionals of the faculty, and the result was that on December 12, 2018, the congregation of the faculty, under the presidency of Professor Dercy Zahn, director of the unit, approved the proposal by unanimity. On May 29, 2019, on the Noble Hall of the faculty, we had the ceremony of the installation of the plaque, and the building started being called Building Professor Paulo Freire. This year, in 2021, we celebrate the centennial of the birth of our patron. On the last 4th, we carried out an event called Paulo Freire, Generating Word, Circle of Culture in honor of the patron of the Brazilian education. It was an affectionate and memorable encounter that gathered colleagues from the education faculty that had the privilege of living with Paulo Freire. This colloquium is part of the set of homages that already occurred and that will still occur to that one that, without a shadow of a doubt, is that intellectual and educator that best represents the popular wishes for a liberating education. More than an academic activity of a great relevance, this colloquium is also fundamentally a political act that shows unequivocally the commitment of the Faculty of Education of Unicamp with the struggle against the barbaric fascism in defense of the human life, the democracy, the human rights, the ethnical and racial diversity and gender diversity, social justice, and naturally an education and a school that are capable of contributing for the historic and ontologic vocation for being more can be a concrete reality for all those people. And to wrap it up, I reproduce the dedication that Paulo Freire wrote in one of his most important works, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, proposing that this is also the spirit of this event. To the poorest of the world and to those who are discovered. And this being discovered, they suffer, but also they struggle. May this also be our struggle. Thank you very much. I invite you all here now to watch with us a small video that will now complement this honor that we would like to pay to the patron of the Brazilian education.
Em 2021 é o ano do centenário de Paulo Freire.
2021 is the year of the centennial of Paulo Freire. Many may not know, but Paulo Freire was a professor in this university as soon as he came back from the exile imposed by the fascism. It worked from 1981 to 1991. In 2012, he received the title of Patron of Brazilian Education. Later on, when conservative movements tried to withdraw this title, progressive sectors in society organize themselves to respect and honor his memory. The Faculty of Education was in this fight as well, and in 2018, the congregation approved unanimously the renaming of the main building of the university as Building Professor Paulo Freire. And the plaque was unveiled in the wall to the left to the entrance to this building. And from now on, anyone who gets in the main building of the Faculty of Education of Unicamp will know immediately that they are getting into Paulo Freire's house. This is an homage from the Faculty of Education to the patron of Brazilian education.
Ok. Ele é só pouquinho, que ainda está no YouTube.
A few seconds only, because it's still on YouTube, please.
Pronto, tá bem.
Ok, muito obrigado.
May go on. Thank you very much. I'll now give the floor to Professor Nima Spigolon, so she can begin our first table with our guest, Professor Nima. Thank you very much, Professor Renee. Once again, it's with a great deal of emotion that we would like to thank all those who participate with us to this historic moment, a moment of resistance, a moment of human education, and a moment in which we turn this hope into a Freire hope. Following our protocol, we have begun with the institutional speech of the director of the School of Education, Unicamp, who already thanked all those who are taking part. Thank you very much, Professor, because I don't have to do it myself. And we just want to state once again our gratefulness to this set of people who make this moment much lighter, make this moment possible, and once again restate their commitment and the commitment of public university to education. So we'll have now our opening conference. And before we give the floor to our speaker, Professor Luiza Cortesão, I would like to invite everyone who is here with us today to see the program for Paulo Freire Centennial in the institutional website of the Faculty of Education. And there you will find the agenda, see the events and the events and ideas and intents of all people who are part of the School of Education, both as an internal and external community. And before I give the floor to our speaker, I would like to speak a little about the dynamics of this roundtable. After the institutional presentation by Professor Renee, we will have the initial speech, the keyword presentation by Professor Luiza Cortesão, who will speak about Paulo Freire and Europe and the part of Europe. Afterwards, we'll have Professor Débora Mazza, who will give us a domestic view on Paulo Freire. And finally, we want to wrap up at 11:30 sharp. Since this is an opening conference, we will not have a debate, that is more prolonged with questions and answers directed to the speakers and to Professor Débora. However, we will have some viewpoints on comments and left on YouTube and on the chat to give it to create that dialogue that Paulo Freire liked so much and trying to implement in his daily life. We will also remind you that our event follows in the afternoon with more speeches. And without further ado, I will now give the floor to our speakers, our professors who will be with us this morning. So we will have our keynote speaker with Professor Luiza Cortesão, who is a benchmark known throughout the world in the domain of research on Paulo Freire. She is an emeritus and full professor of the School of Psychology and Science of Education of the University of Porto, Portugal, and also the chair of the Paulo Freire Institute in Portugal. Professor Débora Mazza is a professor at the School of Education of Unicamp. She has 2 PhDs in France. She's the professor in social science and education. And right now she also a CNPq researcher. And she's also a reference to be looked for in Brazilian social thought and Paulo Freire, and someone who has known Paulo Freire quite well when he was with us. And she's with us this morning. I will now give the floor to our dear guest from abroad, our dear Professor Luiza Cortesão. And I want to tell her she's quite welcome to the land of Paulo Freire and that she feels at home, please, to be part of this historical moment. Professor Luiza, you have the floor. Feel welcome, please, with all my heart, and will now give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Hello?
Is it open? While Professor... Oh, no, there she is. There she is. I will just mention once again that we have 2 interpreters translating. They are Natalia Lessa and Adriana Vieira. And I would like to add the Faculty of Education's committee, which has been deploying all its efforts for the centennial of Paulo Freire, Professor Alessandra Paixão, Professor Mani, Professor Adriana Parani, Professor Cidinha Guedes, Professor Fabiana Rodrigues, Professor Luiz Bragança, and Professor myself and Professor Luiza. So, Professor Luiza, welcome and thank you for being here. I believe that I'm the one who has to thank you because I'm among friends. I see people with whom I share a great deal of emotion, a great deal of concern as well. And my intention, therefore, was begun by thanking you and expressing my gratitude, even though I feel sad, given the circumstances, to be talking to you instead of being talking directly, presentially to you, face to face. However, this is determined by pandemic circumstances, and we have to submit ourselves to these circumstances. That would be my desire. However, I must say that I feel very honored, specifically honored, to be able to talk in a faculty in which I do have the permission to say fascism never again. And as a Portuguese citizen who lived through Portuguese fascism, I can say together with Brazilians, fascism never again. Well, starting,
Então, eu queria agradecer, de
I
facto,
would like to thank you for this possibility that you give me to share a few thoughts that I had. And I want to start by explaining the way I chose to show that topic of Paulo Freire in Europe and from Europe. That is essentially an approach that goes through the value given to the context. What really, that any fact that we want to talk about, and Paulo Freire brilliantly said, it's not just me, any fact, any happening has a different meaning depending on the context in which it is inserted. And actually, Paulo Freire worked in different contexts, and it is important to understand, to value this importance of the context. And in order to do that, I will base myself on a sentence written by Paulo Freire that I will share with you. And this sentence says the following: fact, happening, an achievement, a song, a poem, a book are always involved within the dense tissue touched by multiple reasons of the being, multiple reasons of being, and some are closer to what took place or from what was created than others that are more visible, while reasons of existing. This is why I'm always much more interested in understanding the process in itself and how things happen than the final result. So it is quite clear that Paulo Freire chose to support this option, that I chose to work based on the context of things. But I will not just base myself on Paulo Freire, but also of a small text that I will not read from a French epistologist, Paul, who in his magnificent book on the Méthode told us that, as an example, and he was referring to three geniuses to whom the world owes much of the theoretical and scientific situation that we know. Copernicus, for one. Not Freire, no. I'm sorry, I had a lapse. Copernicus, Newton, no. I'm sorry, I had a lapse. Darwin and Freud. There we go. It was really a lapse. Copernicus, Darwin, and Freud. And what does Débora say in his text? It says it's not by chance that he speaks about Copernicus, Darwin, and Freud. And this same order, and it's not by chance that they came into a world historically in that same order. And he says that quite clearly any one of them had production and achievement that all human beings live under. But just as we can say that they came in that order into the world, the fact is they would be unable to produce their magnificent work except at the time when they came into the world. In other words, they are ahead of their time. They suffer a great deal because of that, but there were researches and questionings at the time. It was a cultural growth, so to speak, that allowed these geniuses to be created. The same Mazza Copernicus with his heliocentric theory, and it was created, and it's impossible to imagine Darwin or Freud in the Middle Ages, because all the set of circumstances that existed at the time would not allow them to exist. And from this mixture of knowledge, questionings, and knowledge, and the times will not allow them to produce the evolutionary theory or the theory of psychology. Therefore, it is based on Débora and Paulo Freire that I say that essentially I will ponder on the context of Paulo Freire's works context. Paulo Freire, when he was young, was someone, and the director of the school already said many things that I'm sharing with you and that I would have said, but he already said them. Paulo Freire, as a young man, started working a great deal. He was a lawyer, he dropped it, he moved on to education, and he worked basically always with those who suffered, the vulnerable, the poor, the oppressed of the world. And through education, he tried to work in such a way that he would fight with them and not only suffer with them. And it's very interesting to realize that the way in which Paulo Freire works with education is a way, and I do not like to call it the Paulo Freire method, because it's much more than a method. It's a whole philosophy, a way of being. And I begin from the analysis of the context in which the people that he's teaching live. And methodologically speaking, we have to realize this is a very intelligent, a very smart way to do things, because people are trying to learn to read and write in situations that are familiar to them. For instance, these persons live through their daily lives during their teaching. It's the first teaching innovation introduced by Paulo Freire, and he really based himself on the daily life of the people he taught, and he identified the word that generated the sentence and followed on. Look at this beautiful picture, and I will show you the next one. And these are technical communities here that you see in these pictures, these are the daily lives of the people who were being taught. And what Paulo Freire did is he asked to Francisco Brennan to draw these pictures. And it's interesting that through time we see that how interesting methodologically speaking is that teaching, that strategy developed by Paulo Freire, because it's in the daily life of the people he was teaching that he based himself using a very innovative methodology for the time, which was the use of slides, as you can see here. And the slides were not just any typical slides. These were slides that had been designed by Francisco Brennan, so of great quality. So that means breaking away from the affective and cognitive barriers that is one of the features of the teaching of Paulo Freire, who is a revolutionary. He developed his work by breaking down many established ideas, shifting from paradigms and conceiving something entirely new and important. As was said here as well, this was a method he applied in Angico. Now we have to do a small parenthesis to put ourselves in the context and to see why this experience had so many outcomes, both positive and negative. At the time in Brazil, you could only vote if you could read and write. And Paulo Freire showed by his experience it was easy to teach people to read and write, adult people, in 40 hours. And much more than that, much more dangerous. It was much more dangerous to teach adults to read and write because they would start voting. But much more dangerous than this is the fact that we know that these adults not only will vote, but will know who they are voting for, because when they start learning to read and write, and there is a constant exchange between the teacher and the person who is taught, and these persons will move on from the non-awareness of the situation of oppression they are living to the awareness of the fact that they are subject to exploitation and oppression, and also a critical awareness of this oppression. And finally, they will acquire the capacity to fight against this oppression. That, in other words, awareness. So it couldn't be more dangerous for the regime that was beginning at the time, which was the dictatorship. So that one of the persons that saw the distribution of the degrees given, the certificates of literacy given to the people who had been taught, who was among the military, Corazons Fernandes, said something that became quite famous and translated how threatened he felt by this experience. And the sentences, then he said to someone, his son, you do know that you are fattening the serpents on the ground. These were the adults that were whose awareness had been raised by literacy through Paulo Freire's teaching. And the result was evident. that soon they curtailed this experience. And President Goulart had authorized and promoted this national plan based on Paulo Freire's data. What took place afterwards as a consequence of that was that Paulo Freire was in prison, and then he was exiled from the country. And I hesitated here because I remember something that I had the privilege of hearing. I went to Angica and I spoke to old men who were the ones taught by Paulo Freire. And the fact is that the wealth that you can feel when you hear these people talking, there was an elderly man, he said, I know now who to vote for. So Paulo Freire had to be exiled. He went to Europe. And what kind of Europe was that at the time? It was a Europe that had just left Nazi fascism. And it was 1945.
And what actually happened was that it's very difficult to characterize Europe at that age because it was very plural in different situations. When the war ended, Europe embraced the idea that it needed something better. So the 1950s were years of hope, years of judging that people and things were going to get better. In the 1960s, with the crisis of oil and the great industries, what happened was that at the end of the 1960s, Europe realized that hope was something that was in decay. What happened was, before I continue, I have to remind you that one of the weird things was that Nazi fascism ended, but in Europe, there were still 3 dictatorial regimes that were happening, one in the Iberic Peninsula. I am sad to show to people that started those dictatorships in the Iberian Peninsula, which are Salazar and Franco, and 2 colonels in Greece. Still in the dictatorships in the Iberian Peninsula and Greece, we had the beginning of the conquistadorship in Europe that was still a reflection of the Second World War. It wasn't the beginning of a fair world. It was in this context that Paulo Freire came to his exile. And I'm going to show you some illustrations of what is an exile. This is Paulo Freire with his son at the airport.
A Europa começa.
At the end of the 1960s, Europe was doing some social intervention proposals, and this is one of the very known images of May 1968, which is the awakening of an explosion of fantastic proposals, not only at a population level, but also at a union level. There is a very famous image that illustrates the French academia and the French population in the 1960s. This is another image of May 1968. Symbolically, this poster shows what was happening in May 1968, and it translates the climate that was happening in France at the time. I would like to start with this sentence: Il est interdit d'interdire. It is forbidden to forbid. Be realistic. Ask for the impossible. These are symbols from May 1968. This other sentence: Soyez réaliste, demandez l'impossible. Be realistic, demand the impossible, as I said. These are words of order from this passionate, lyrical fight that was happening not only at an academic level, but also at many other levels. For example, in Italy, we had the same movement happening. There were some political agitation. I could also say that further ahead, but one of the interesting actions that Paulo Freire had in Europe was with the workers' unions in Italy. One of the vindications of the unions were the number of hours that the workers in the factories worked in Italy. That was one of the things that Paulo Freire participated in, a project that was supported by Paulo Freire in Italy, payment of overtime and fair work hours for the industry workers in Italy. It is not only a political revolution in Europe. I brought here some images where you can see from the top down, for example, a series of celebrities that were many very significant that came for us culturally. We have the Beatles, and next to the Beatles, on the left-hand side, Jacques Brel from Belgium, Léon Ferré in the center. In general, we have the author cinema that happened in Italy, France, Belgium with Godard, and Agnès Varda, for example, that is on the right-hand side of the slide, until the Rolling Stones. I have here a photo of them in the beginning, and a photo of them now. And on the left-hand side, we have a person that is particularly dear to us, José D'Afonso, who is an author like Sérgio Godinho, Zé Mário Branco. Zé Afonso is particularly important because, as you all know, besides his beautiful songs as a composer and a singer, his song was one of the codes for a revolution that happened on April 24th. This shows how exactly the revolution happened in 1974, how the end of the dictatorships happened in Europe. Paulo Freire had a famous sentence that said, I cannot go to Portugal and Spain because Portugal has Salazar and Spain has Franco, and they do not allow us to go there. They do not allow me and pedagogy, the pedagogy of the oppressed. And in 1974, the dictatorship ended in Portugal, and Freire came to Portugal. In 1978, the dictatorship ended in Spain. In Spain, the king promoted the free elections in 1978. And in 1974, we also had the end of the colonial dictatorships in Greece. We have some images here of the April 25th in Portugal. Symbolically, we have the carnations that were placed on the barrel of the shotguns. And on the streets, we have people that were raising flags that said freedom. Here on the next picture, we have the death of Franco. It is very important to know about, at a cultural level, that we had so many interventions, but at a scientific level, it is very important that we know that they also happened. We have Baudelaire Passon, that published the book in 1971. In 1970, we had a Baudelaire that published L'École Capitaliste en France, the capitalist school in France. Franz Bourdin, which is also a very famous author, very famous for an important and current chain of thought in France. It is a magical year. It is an year of effervescence, a convergence of different works at all different levels. As an example, Sousa Santos works on the epistemologies of the South, the epistemologies of the South America and Africa, where he describes what were his findings in his work. Paulo Freire, then, has a very important quote. At the time, myself and the pedagogy of the oppressed were forbidden of entering Spain and Portugal. The Spain of Franco and Portugal of Salazar forbid us both, pedagogy and myself. This was the quote that I mentioned a few slides ago. We have to consider two actors here, the pedagogy and myself, the pedagogy and Paulo Freire. Well, after this first introduction, I would like to mention what Paulo Freire has done in Europe and after he arrived in Europe. It is important to mention the urgency of the work of Paulo Freire in Europe. There were three main levels of work in which he developed his studies. The first one is relatively the third world of the first world. This is another quote of Paulo Freire. The work that I developed in Europe with the oppressed of the world. A second line of work would be the theoretical production and the disclosure of his work. And the third work stream of Paulo Freire is in Africa and in the world. I'm going to approach quickly the two first ones, and I'm going to describe more carefully the third one. The first one, the third world and the third world and the first world. What he meant by that, he meant the poverty of the immigrants that are escaping the misery in their countries and they're going to rich countries. They go to those rich countries and they are living in another misery, another situation of poverty. It's the coexistence of the third world in the first world, which is the world of the rich. These are the immigrants that escaped from Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy, Turkey, etc. And I would like to say 2 or 3 things about what was going on with the immigrants from Portugal and Spain. This is a quote from Paulo Freire. At that time, because of pedagogy, I came in contact with the harsh reality of one of the most dramatic dimensions of the third world and the first world. The reality of several immigrant workers from Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Turkey, Arabic countries, Switzerland, France, Germany, experience of racial discrimination, class, and sex. Portuguese immigrants would go from Portugal to other countries for 2 reasons. Because they were escaping colonial wars. Normally, we would have immigrants from a higher class that were able to escape illegally, of course. And then we would have the poor ones. And within the poor ones, we would have 2 subsections. The poor immigrants that would pack their suitcases and would go into an adventure, that would try to survive and gain money to build their houses in small villages. They would go by train with their suitcases, and when they would arrive at their destinations, when they would go from Portugal to France, they would jump from the train because they were illegal. That is an image of a train where people would go from a Portuguese train to a French train. They would hopping from a train to another. And this is an image of other immigrants that wouldn't come by train. They would walk. These are immigrants that would cross Spain and Portugal walking as pilgrims to be able to reach a place where they would think that they would live in better conditions. This is a group of immigrants. For example, these are Spanish immigrants that also would walk in the asphalt. So they think, as I said, that they were going to a better place. Those are the ones that stay at the bidonville. They stay at the worst situations of poverty, ill treatment, the worst conditions of life. This is a photo taken by a famous French photographer, Blancourt. Another photo of the Bidonville, a village that had the worst life conditions. It is a very sad situation. This photographer was known as the photographer who would take the best pictures of the oppressed of the world. So what these people who lived at the bidonville would be subject to, any conditions of work. One of the things that would happen in France was that they were very badly welcomed by their colleagues in France. They came from Portugal, where strikes were completely forbidden. They were inexistent. Only very brave strikes happened sporadically. Strikes practically did not happen. Work strikes practically did not happen. And the workers were very exploited, very ill-treated. And with this group, Paulo Freire worked promoting encounters, meetings. He would meet up with Spanish, Italian, Portuguese immigrants. He would talk to them, and he would try to raise awareness on the exploration and conditions of work, and that was a very difficult job. And he said that he did that with a lot of satisfaction and with a lot of pleasure, and he felt that was a very important work. The second work stream of his studies in Europe was relatively the discussion and the publication of his work. He wrote several books while he was in Europe, and he was allied to the group of IDAC, which is a group of Brazilian exiled in Geneva, and they wrote books extraordinarily important books. They wrote a sociology treaty that is a sociology essay that is very important for the immigrants at the time. But besides, what happens is Paulo Freire published The Pedagogy of the Oppressed during his exile in Chile in Spanish, and the first edition in English dates back to 1971. And this book, translated into English, created a big expansion, and other books by Paulo Freire started being translated from the pedagogy of the oppressed. And that was when Paulo Freire started watching the disclosure and the publication of his books in different languages.
Very interesting to say that the first edition of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, written in Portuguese, was be obtained in Portugal despite the dictatorship by a publishing house that at the time was an association that led to the creation of publishing house Afrontamento, who is in contact with Paulo Freire and asked him to send the manuscript from Pedagogia do Oprimido, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and they printed in 1972. So the first edition is in Portugal, takes place in Portugal. After that, from them on, from this Portuguese edition to other countries, the English one among others, there is a broad, his work is broadly made known, and Paulo Freire becomes, and there's a research on that, becomes a well-known name. He's one of the most frequently quoted authors in human sciences. He's one of the authors that is most often mentioned, is one of the three of them. So it's really someone that is enormously known throughout the world. Little did they know, those who forced him into exile, that this was the opening of his work to the world. And it was exactly the opposite of what they wanted to take place. In addition to all this, there is also the academic recognition of Paulo Freire's work. And in this recognition and acknowledgement, there are a great number of honoris causa titles that are given him. Several conferences that he attended in which he was a keynote speaker, discussions, debates, cultural circles that he developed. So this is the second main line of his work. The third one is very interesting as well. And I believe that is the most interesting of all of them. Paulo Freire was working in the World Church Council and simultaneously at the University of Geneva giving classes. And he was invited at a given point to go to Zambezia in Africa. Curiously, he liked being in Geneva, and despite many people insisting with him to go to other universities, Paulo Freire accepted the invitation from Africa. Why? Because in Africa, in Zambezia, he had very challenging conditions to meet. And you can see that because he took the challenge on directly. We must not forget that Zambezia at the time, while Júlio Meirelles Zambezia, a sociologist, and he proposed for Zambezia a specific form of socialism permeated by cultural issues pertaining to the country. As a sociologist, and he was someone very intelligent and well-learned, he supported fully everything that had to do with education and social issues. The context, the political context, therefore, of the country was indeed extremely interesting for Paulo Freire. There was, however, something that was even more interesting to him. In that country, at the time, there was a great project of research on participative action that was led by, that's the other picture, not this one, but this lady, you can see up there on top, Major Lisa Sampson. And Major Lisa Sampson, she was Finnish, and she had gone to Tanzania to spearhead this project. And in addition to that, there was another main project that was being developed by the person that's on her side on the slide, who was Buffon, someone who worked on participative research. And in Zambezi, there was also, together with Marjan and Buffon, there was work being conducted on research and participative action. Why am I talking about this? What was there in Africa? Let's move back. That could interest Paulo Freire to go there. Paulo Freire had a great deal of consideration for Amilcar Cabral, who was the mentor of the resistance to the Portuguese colonial government in Guinea. And Amilcar Cabral was simultaneously a land grabber, someone who would, he was also the head of troops, but he educated them for the future. The text showed that Amilcar Cabral, he was someone who was really great in his thoughts. In addition to Amilcar Cabral, who Paulo Freire respected a great deal, there were many other persons who were important. We have Samara Machel, who was from the Failing Movement in Mozambique, and likewise, as we had here, there were revolutionary movements in all the colonies that belonged to Portugal. What was very interesting was that Paulo Freire reached Africa and got in touch with all these movements. He got in touch with Freiling, with PSDC, with all the movements. And one of the countries with which he worked directly was São Tomé. And I will insist on that because normally when we talk about Paulo Freire in Africa, we talk about his work in Guinea, which was already disclosed, and his work with Amilcar Cabral. When the president invites Paulo Freire to make a proposal for the change of education in Guinea. But it's not only in Guinea that he works, but also in São Tomé. He had direct interference in the creation of the educational system of the country. What happens with regards to Pierre Jussin, Freire, and all the other movements is related to everything that takes place in Africa. And I'll make a small change here to my presentation, then I'll go back to that. In this picture, we have someone else that I haven't pointed out yet. So in addition to Amilcar Cabral, you have Julius Nyerere from Tanzania, and you have Fox Borda, who is from South America, but Fox Borda felt so pressured, so anguished by the misery and exploitation of his people that he decided to open a university. He left. He said that the university would not allow him to work the way he wanted, which was a kind of social intervention. So he spent 18 years outside the university to work for participative action, and which he meets Paulo Freire and Bernard. And Franz Bernard must have had, I'm not absolutely sure, but he must have had read the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and during the oral phase of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and in Chile, without publishing the book, there were only 3 chapters of the book that were written. What he does is he conducts conferences with speeches and meetings and discussions based on the book. And at a given time, people tell him it's okay. At a given moment, everyone will know the book without having read the book. And these 3 chapters make a pause on the oral phase, and then he writes the 4th chapter. And in the United States, he publishes the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And François Bordard, working with Paulo Freire at the time, must have learned about the content of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And there is a convergence between François Bordard's work and Paulo Freire's work. And each one of them calls things with different names. Paulo Freire talks about his pedagogy and his teaching, and he links all the processes of research, of theory, conception, and anthropology. Everything is under the umbrella of pedagogy. And first words, research, participative action, and participative research together with that all. They created the acronym research, participative research and action, with which Paulo Freire gets in touch, but he does not adopt this acronym. He keeps on talking about his pedagogy, as he calls it. So what does Paulo Freire do at this time? He goes to Africa, in addition to getting in touch with all the movements, revolutionary movements against Portuguese colonialism. He works with people from South Africa without going there, of course, because he's not allowed to. But he gets in touch with many people in South Africa, and they say, and I could find that in material about this topic, people there still use Paulo Freire's work material to raise awareness among people. People at this time were, it was particularly urgent to do because South Africa was the South Africa of apartheid as we know it. It was the summit of discrimination, so to speak, at the time. It was racial exploitation and oppression at its most. We cannot even imagine it. So what Paulo Freire does during his African phase is going to Tanzania. After that, he gets in touch with all revolutionary movements. He works with all of them. And In addition to that, he gets involved in the South African issue, helping those who fight apartheid in South Africa. But Paulo Freire was a wanderer. He had wanderlust. The fact is, it's amazing how much he managed to do in Africa. He starts first by visiting the countries in Africa, and then he moves throughout the world. He really was a wanderer. And that's when he creates this main project of literacy for Guinea, which is not so successful as it could be because of political issues.
O que eles decidem na Guiné?
So what they decide in Guinea is the language of literacy must be Portuguese. And Paulo Freire says in his letters from Guinea-Bissau that teaching people to raise them awareness in the language of the colonizer is very difficult. And therefore the program that he must submit to the government, he has to, because it was a governmental requirement, does not work as well as he wanted it to. What I was trying to say is that he traveled the whole world, and from Guinea to Papua to New Zealand, you see Paulo Freire everywhere in the world. And he was, in fact, the wanderer who took his message to all places he traveled to in the world. And Paulo Freire is interesting to compare with his work, the stance he takes in his work, and Olaus Fartos Bordat, who worked with research and participative action within an attempt to show that revolution is something acceptable, necessary within the conditions that people live in. And Paulo Freire often working in a more subtle way bets on the raising of individual awareness, works on information, on the results that education can bring, on the education of people who can then fight for better conditions of life. And this is how we see him in New Zealand, in Australia, in Papua New Guinea. As I said, that's how he managed to get into South Africa, even though he never sets foot in there, but his work is known there. And is extremely appreciated in South Africa because he worked on this slow attempt of raising people's awareness about the submission in which they live and then start fighting against it. Give them the tools to do that. So this is why with Paulo Freire, I wanted to conclude my presentation. I don't know if I'm within my allotted time. Yes, you're doing quite well. You have 60 minutes, so don't worry. So I will conclude with an inspiring sentence a sentence that will inspire anyone who will have political or civil awareness of the importance of his work. He says, I am a professor in favor of constant fight against any kind of discrimination against economic prevalence of individuals or social classes. I am a professor who fights against the existing capitalist order that invented this freak situation, misery and wealth. I'm a professor in favor of hope that moves me on despite everything. And allow me to add something else. Being the hope, despite of this awareness of a lack within wealth, he has hope. He keeps on hoping, and he hopes as a sociologist that is aware of the possibilities of intervention despite the limitations, the structural limitations of capital, of political circumstances, and of the forces that have dominated the world and keep on dominating it. Paulo Freire was aware of this possibility and thought it was necessary to be aware of the limitations that are imposed, because being aware of these limitations allows us to find gaps and cracks in these limitations, and thereby introduce change. This is utopia. Is more than utopia. It is the viable creation of Paulo Freire. I hope I was able to show you some of the greatness of this great man.
Thank you, our dear Professor Luiza Cortesão, that has touched us deeply with her sensitivity, with her intellectual preparation, her affectionate speech, with her memoirs that allows other historic characters that have marked the pages of history in many different fields of knowledge. Professor Luiza is a living history of the commitment of the revolution that Paulo Freire is still idealizing. It's a very loving speech. She has a revolutionary speech, as revolutionary as Paulo Freire, I would say. Please receive the loving hugs of all of us, despite the distance of all this ocean. We welcome you and we receive you here with many other people that are committed to changing the world. So, embraced by this emotion, we still have the mornings of sun. We have a beautiful day here. So we pass the floor now to Professor Débora Mazza, our dear Professor Débora. She is going to bring the topic, a national look and a dialogue on Paulo Freire. We would like to remind you that this is a conference, so we're not going to have debates, but we're going to have dialogues with the people that are watching us in other occasions. So Professor Débora, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Professor Nima. I would like to thank Professor Luiza immensely for being here with us in the celebration of the centennial of Paulo Freire and Raymond Williams. Sharing their works with the popular classes and educating young adults. I would like to say to everyone who is following us that I am a white woman with mid-length hair. I'm wearing a white shirt with floral print with my shoulders that are appearing. I would also like to thank you all for the dedication. I would like to thank the professionals, educators, and professors who are here with us, and everyone who is watching us on YouTube, everyone who dedicates part of their lives to the education. I'm going to open with a sentence by Professor Paulo Freire. I'm going to make an interface with Professor Luiza Cortesão, bringing not Paulo Freire from the exile that traveled around Europe until 1970, when he was able to recover his passport that was removed from his possessions in 1964, and was returned back to him at the end of 1969. Paulo returned to Brazil in 1980, and that was the period when Professor Luiza finished her speech, showing organically a world that may seem distant to us. The misery, the poverty, the lack of opportunity that affects popular groups and the working classes. Of course, in an unequal way, globally. Freire was just presented to us until the 1980, and now I'm going to do an interface, a dialogue with Professor Luiza, bringing to us Paulo Freire from Brazil from 1920 until 1964, which was when he had to go into exile, which was when he had to leave the country. That is what I want to speak about. I want to speak about this Paulo Freire when he was constituted as a political being, as a social being, and as a professor and researcher. I am working on this time frame as an invitation of Professor Paulo Freire, starting with this quote that I'm going to share with you now. He says, "It would be unthinkable to have a world where the human experience happens in absence of necessary continuity," which means outside of history. In the sense, the death of history implies the death of women and men, because women and men could not survive the death of history, which, since it is made by them, it is made and remade. What happens is the overcoming of a historical phase by another one, which does not eliminate the continuity of history and change, and neither change in history. This is a sentence, a quote by Paulo, which is found in a book organized by Paulo himself called A Sombra de uma Mangueira. I'm going to try to insert Paulo historically in the decades of 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I would like to point out that Paulo lived his childhood, youth, and adolescence marked by national and international scenarios and processes of social changes that characterized the national and international scenarios, the maturity, the professional and personal insertion of Paulo, and according to my hypothesis, replicate themselves in the movements and travels of Paulo throughout Latin America and Europe, and also Africa, as Professor Luiza mentioned in her presentation. During the childhood, youth, and maturity of Paulo Freire from the 1920s until 1964 were decades that promoted the political modernization of the Brazilian government, the economic progress that claimed for social development. It was necessary to have processes, institutions, and actors that served as mediators, and much more than mediators, inducers of change. The production model, which was urban and industrial, was consolidating in Brazil at that time. We had the consolidation of a modern state that should leverage the economic growth and conditions of Brazil to participate in the global economy, and that demanded a national development and the integration of social groups which were so far excluded from the social order that was commanded so far by an agricultural economy. In order to do so, we needed an elaboration of a public instruction project. This project appears throughout these decades as a strategic political variant that is capable of intensifying the modernization of the production process, equalizing the regional inequalities that we could find in different spheres of social life, dynamizing the income of different social classes. We needed, therefore, structures, institutions, and actors that would insert the Brazilian society in this capitalist order. Paulo Freire was an advocate of a campaign that started in 1920 by many intellectuals and social scientists, among them Lourenço Filho, Anísio Teixeira, Fernandes Ribeiro. Those were intellectuals that took part in many reforms in the educational system in Ceará from 1922 to 23, in Bahia from 1924 to 29, in São Paulo from 1930 to 31, in the Federal District from 1931 to 35. They were signatories of the manifests of the pioneers of new education since 1932, and from these experiences, they explored the development and the importance of a scientific outlook on society and systematic surveys on the national problems, linking them to several deficits and deficiencies that existed in the processes of development, the social, political, and economic development in Brazil. Among them, we could highlight the public instruction, the public educational system. CAPES, the Coordination of Personal Improvement of Superior Level, INEP, the National Institute of Educational Studies and Research, they ordered a big survey that was carried out by Costa Pinto and Edson Carneiro, actually, in the 1950s in Brazil. And this survey was a mapping of the importance of social sciences in Brazil. The importance of looking at Brazil as a country that demanded scientific analysis and a social thinking focused on emotional reality and focused on the real interests and needs of the Brazilian people, taking into account the constitution of a democratic Brazilian nation. I bring here some elements surveyed and pointed out by Costa Pinto and Edson Carneiro in their survey, so we can understand the heritage and the constellations in which Paulo Freire, his work, his line of thought, and his books were based on in the national scenario. So the report says there is today in Brazil the formation of a climate of interest that demands practical initiatives, the industrialization, the urbanization, the orientation of the Brazilian thinking, the expansion of the proletariat, the development of the middle classes, the bureaucratization of the public and private administrations, the demographic expansion, the underdeveloped areas of an underdeveloped country, the internal migrations, the agricultural crisis, the condition of the indigenous populations, the labor condition, the worsening of the class conflicts, they are contradictions of the position that Brazil occupies in the worldwide economy. This is a cry for structural changes. These authors, these institutions, they disputed several interpretations theories for Brazil. This was a year in which the interpretations of Brazil and Latin America disputed different perspectives and different projects of construction for the economy, politics, and society. So today, when we look at a society that is highly polarized with different projects, political and economic and social projects that are in dispute, this is not a new scenario. This already existed in Brazil in the 1920s, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, in which Paulo lived, matured, and started in the area of education. In his initial studies, according to Costa, That is what contaminated Paulo, and that is what he studies in his travels in Latin America, the United States, and Europe. Moved by issues that were part of this national scenario. And that is what built Paulo as an educator and as a researcher. It is important to remind you, and Professor Luiza already brought some past elements, and I would like to move back in time and think about which were the scenarios that Paulo watched and Paulo participated in dialogue to think about himself as a social being. He went through a Second World War in 1945, the beginning of the Cold War, the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and the Alliance for Progress in the 1960s, which was a big project of investment, which were the countries allied to the United States after the Second World War, when we take into account the recovery and the investment in Brazil and Latin America. A socialist project rather than a capitalist project. The processes of decolonialization in the world, not only in Africa, the class struggle, the acknowledgement of Western democracies, and also the awareness on the complexity of the correlation of forces at a national, regional, and international level in a historical critical tradition. That is, the geopolitical position that the country occupied in these decades is an element of from many theories of interpretation about Brazil. The debate on the delay, the role of the intellectuals in the overcoming of the traditional order, the patrimonialist order, the deficiencies in our institutions, the strong colonialist legacy, patriarchal legacy of our economic formation, and the late entrance of Brazil in the continent, in the political agenda of the continent. The institutionalization of social sciences in Brazil. Added to all of that, we have the understanding of socialist movements rethinking through the third international journey the project of nationalist projects of the communist parties, trying to lead the democratic bourgeois revolution as a stage of the socialist revolution. So in this ambiance of continuities,
de continuidades que Paulo se banha.
Paulo Freire started his works. These continuities were linked to a hegemony of a liberal bourgeois construction that allowed possibilities of the traditional agrarian societies when they reached the statute of urban industrial societies according to the model that was already traced by Western countries that mobilized English industrial revolutions, French political and American social revolutions. And the idea was that the modernization process demanded orientation of social action in order to produce societies in which the intellectual and technical performance of different social classes could offer conditions of positioning the occupational structure of capitalism. Of all classes.
tirou o compartilhamento, viu, da tela.
He took off the sharing. Can you hear me? Yes, I would like you to talk closer to the microphone, please. So, based on that, intellectuals, educators are called to participate in the creation of this project, the development of inclusive, democratic, participative public policies. It's following that Wanheim is one of the thinkers who comes, is invited by CEPAL, ESEP, Social Sciences, and by Paulo Freire's work, especially in his first work, education and Brazilian events and education for the oppressed. And it was, the idea was to challenge and overcome the deficits and gaps that created the difficulties for the development of the country, with the idea of liberating us. So that's how education comes up, one of the social techniques as one of the mediations that can accelerate the insertion of society in a democratic environment. And it is this political institutional framework, this bubbling up of the development in Brazil, that deployed players, institutions who transform Brazil in the lab for the research and their intervention to help public policies and induce social changes to achieve a less violent and unequal society. And it is within the framework of this horizon that education comes up as an heuristic variable to accelerate social change and contributes to unveil the scope on inequalities and identify traditional sectors of society that did not want, that resisted to the processes of change that were taking place. It was a tug of war between the archaic Brazil and the modern Brazilian impulse to go forward. This is a thought that helps us to understand Paulo Freire and to understand the contemporary circumstances of the processes we go through today. Paulo Freire was reached by these situations, and from his first thoughts and writings on the national situation, he worked based on these three pillars: state, politics, and society, and understand it was impossible to think about education without inserting it in the forms of organization that structured social relations. And he adopted the concept of a social problem that came from North America, and he developed it in his own way. Social problems for Paulo Freire did not mean degradation, but social problems were understood as developmental situations and the raising of the awareness of the population. So based on Horaci Nogueira, Paulo distances himself from the benchmark set by North American authors such as Albert Herman, Richard Fuller, and Robert Park, who define social problems as situations of social disorganization and social degradation. For Paulo and Horaci, social problems had to do with the development of the raising of awareness, thereby the importance of the concept of awareness raising. Another topic that is important in these years in which Paulo Freire matures and comes up as a researcher, a thinker on the area of education, is the topic of social changes in Brazil that was dear to many social thinkers in Brazil. And there is an appropriation by Brazilian intellectuals, especially among those to whom Paulo talked. And I will bring you here Costa Pinto, who has an interesting definition and who was one of the intellectuals who moved around the institutions and agencies in which Paulo worked, such as the Research Center of Brazil. Costa Pinto says, social change is not a cultural process as perceived by North American sociology, that it was understood that the process of urbanization, modernization in its wake would bring naturally social changes and the construction or a more democratic society. For Costa Pinto and for the intellectuals who thought about this issue of social problems, such as Florestan Fernandes and many others, social change was not a natural process. It was a matter for discussion in different processes of society. And Costa Pinto states in a seminar that problematized social change in Brazil, that the development of Latin America, analyzed from the standpoint of factors that oppose resistance, the intention was to check the experience of the factors that can promote social changes based on the dialectic intervention. In other words, it was necessary to think social problems in Brazil and Latin America based on their antithesis. In other words, based on the factors that hindered and prevented social changes in those countries. It was necessary to look for breaking up points, for cracks and transformations, contradictions, asymmetries, and vicious circles, closed loops. And Paulo Freire really inspired himself on this source, on the crisis of the structures. So thinking social change not as a natural process, but based on its opposite, from the dialectical perspective, based on the resistant factors and these social groups that are plunged in a traditional order that do not want change, that will prevent change to take place and prevent a more equal society. Paulo based himself on this line of thought, and he adopted this concept of social change and adopted education as the heuristic field of evaluation of how much society resisted faced with social change. In 1959, he participates in the Second National Congress of Education for Adults, presenting a research developed with illiterate adults in Recife, and it's called Education of Adults and Marginalized Populations, the problem of Mocambos. And this work, education, is shown as a continuous and interrupted process that goes from the cradle to the tomb. And it's a process that does not develop normally or naturally. It is a process that has to be fought for, especially in the countries of Latin America. In 1959, in another paper that he presents for the University of Recife, now called Federal University of Pernambuco. It's called Education and Current Situation in Brazil. he once again points out that we must think about our problems, and we need to put them in a cultural context and immerse ourselves in our reality to see what we must do to develop the country in order to develop democratic thoughts for the education. And he highlighted a lack of trust, or an idea rather, that the dominating classes had no interest in changing the traditional order of things and construct democratic order. And Paulo understood we needed to promote and adjust the views of these opposites in society. We had to improve our democratic dialogue in Brazil. And given that I'm a little late, I will skip forward. And I will go to a correlation that I would like to highlight between the political nature that was Paulo's priority in all his writings and understand that popular education, in other words, education for all, bearing in mind the construction of a society that has room for all, is the main project of Paulo's educational project. Paulo understood that Brazilian society was very unequal, and you needed to invest things. In 1964, he has to leave Brazil. He is exiled. He goes to Bolivia, to Chile, then the United States, and finally he ends up in Switzerland. And there in Switzerland and the World Council of Churches, he works on the insertions in Africa, in the countries that were fighting against the Portuguese colonial systems. It is important to rethink that viewpoint of indignation that we find in Paulo against injustice, and that resists coldness and distances and calculative, insensitive posture faced with suffering. And it's important for us to get this posture from a document in which 4,500,000 people are dead because of the pandemic. And it's important to think of the critical perspective of Paulo Freire, and in this key of antithesis to see what are the factors that prevent human development in Brazil and the development of a more equalitarian society. Payne suggests that the challenge in society and education that makes us think that Auschwitz should not be repeated. So what took German societies, a society that was highly advanced, to that was so well educated, that what took a kind of society like the German one that pretend that not to notice the death of 6 million people in concentration camps in atrocious situations. Paulo Freire says it's the feeling in culture, the bad feeling culture, this passive attitude, this shock, and this feeling of disputes that make a consumption society to turn people and desires into things, and create a feeling of indifference towards what happens to other people. And I will raise this opposition. And I understand that the pedagogy of the oppressed, the pedagogy of the autonomy, the pedagogy of indignation, pedagogy of questions that are legacies that are left by Paulo Freire's thought can help us to suspend the coldness that leads to educational practices and that can help as an antidote against this feeling of not being well in culture, with coldness with regard to someone else's suffering, and can help us to bring down the barbarisms that brings inequality in society. And I will wrap up with a sentence from Paulo stating that women and men can change the world, and we have to try to do what is less unfair, but based on an historic and concrete reality. No dreams and no illusionary roots. The transformation of the world is a political action, and it would be naive not to recognize that dreams lead to projects. The historical movement reveals old scars that affected the interests of groups, the dominating classes, prejudices, and the ideologies that perpetuate themselves in contradiction with the aspects that beg for change. There is no current moment that is not the scene for confrontations between forces that act and react to abuse, forces that fight among themselves. And it is in that sense that we find in our current situation the strong marks of our colonial past that create hurdles to the progress of modernity. These are the marks of a past that cannot last long, but insists in prolonging its presence to the detriment of change and through hate. And I will wrap up here, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much to Débora Marta. And we are here so moved by her words and her presence that we can hardly speak. And we want to record the presence of several educational experiences.
Lá pelo chat da
I would
transmissão.
like to thank our colleagues, our friends from Brazil and from the world who have manifested through the chat on YouTube, our colleagues here from Unicamp, our students, our education professionals, especially the professors from the faculty school, from the faculty of education of Unicamp. And to wrap up, I would like to remind you that we will return at 12:30 Brazil time, Unicamp time, because of the time zone. We have international guests. Our round table number 2 will start at 12:30. And we will have as a mediator our friend, our colleague, Professor Alexandre Paixão. I would like to finish with the quote from Paulo. I would like to be reminded as a subject that changes the world, the people, the animals, the nature, the earth, and we could love each other when we don't love ourselves. Even when we don't love ourselves, love is immunity for humankind. Paulo Freire lives. Now I pass the floor to Professor René, who is going to wrap up officially this conference of the morning. This is an opening speech of the centennial of Paulo Freire and Raymond Williams, Sparks of Transformation. Once again, my dearest thank you to Professors Luiza Cortesão and Professor Débora Mazza. Professor René, the floor is yours. I would just like to echo my thank you to the colleagues who were part of the first table. Professor Luiza Cortesão, thank you very much for your kindness. Thank you very much for your availability, for the class that you brought to us today, the lesson on this formation of the School of Thought of Paulo Freire, Professor Débora Mazza, the legitimate representative who had the luck of meeting Paulo Freire, who is going to continue Paulo Freire's legacy in our university. Thank you very much for your availability and disposition of being here as well. Thank you, Professor Nima, for your mediation, and thank you for the kind words as you just spoke right now. I would like to remind you that in the afternoon, we're going to have the conference on Raymond Williams, mediated by Professor Alexandre Paixão, as it was said. And we meet you back again at 12:30 Brazil time.